Hey Night Owl, I'm Kay. Welcome back to True Asian Nightmare. If you've had a long, stressful, or just completely exhausting day, take a breath. You can leave it all at the door. I'll be right here to keep you company through the night. Tonight, we've got a new collection of true horror stories, straight from the darkest corners of Asia. If you're new here, and you like winding down with stories like these, feel free to subscribe and hit the bell. I've always got a new one waiting for you, every other night. Before we dive in, I'd really love it if you could share where you're tuning in from, and what time it is right now. You never know. Someone else out there might be sharing the exact same midnight hour with you. All right, get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let's get into tonight's first story. I don't really know how to start this, to be honest, but I need to get it out of my head, because every time I see an old tree, my chest gets tight. This happened a long time ago, back when I was in the 3rd grade, but my brain still holds onto it like it was yesterday. I was a really, really skinny kid, like clinically malnourished, visible ribs, always getting sick kind of skinny. I grew up in Vietnam, specifically near Cho Lan, which is this incredibly dense, historical Chinatown district, where the air always smells like a heavy mix of exhaust fumes and bitter herbal medicine. Because I was so small and so slow, I was the ultimate target. There were these 2 massive kids in my class. Let's just call them Keegan and Preston. I don't know what they were feeding these kids, but they were built like tanks compared to me, and they made my life an absolute living hell. It started with the standard crap, you know? Shoving me in the hallways, knocking my books out of my hands, stealing my pencils, the kind of low-level torment that teachers never seemed to notice. But it peaked one afternoon. I was taking my sweet time packing my bag because I was just slow at everything back then, and the second the teacher stepped out of the room, they jumped me. It wasn't just Keegan and Preston either. They brought like 5 other kids. They just swarmed me. I remember the smell of dusty chalk and cheap floor wax as I hit the ground, and they just started kicking and punching. My nose was bleeding, my eyes were swelling up, and I remember looking up at Keegan and asking him through my tears why he was doing this, and he just sneered and told me he hit me because he felt like it, and because I packed my bag too slow. Kids are psychopaths, man. They really are. The worst part is, I didn't even want to tell my parents. Keegan threatened that if I snitched, he'd kill me, and my dumb 8-year-old brain believed him. So I walked out to the school gate with my uniform covered in dirt and blood, trying to hide my face, but my dad was there to pick me up. He took one look at me and completely lost his mind. He dragged the truth out of me, and the very next day he marched into the principal's office and raised absolute hell. It was this huge ordeal. The bullies got their conduct grades slashed, their parents were brought in, the whole 9 yards. But my dad knew that just getting them in trouble wasn't going to magically make me safe. As we were walking out of the school that afternoon, holding hands, he stopped by the security booth. There was this big glass corkboard where they pinned up extracurricular flyers, and right in the center was an ad for an after-school taekwondo class held right there in the school courtyard. My dad didn't even hesitate. He signed me up on the spot, telling me that I was going to bulk up, learn how to fight, and become the next Bruce Lee, and that once those kids saw me wearing a martial arts uniform, they'd never lay a finger on me again. I was actually kind of pumped about it. We went and bought the crisp white uniform, the belt, the whole setup, and surprisingly, my dad was right. Once word got out that I was taking martial arts, Keegan and his crew completely backed off. I guess the combination of the principal breathing down their necks and the idea of me learning how to kick people in the face was enough to keep them away. But that class, man, that class was the start of something so much worse than getting bullied. You have to understand the layout of my elementary school to get why this was so creepy. It was located near Tran Hung Dao Street, which is this massive, ancient avenue lined with these towering trees that were planted by the French colonialists over a century ago. These trees are gargantuan. Their roots tear up the sidewalks, and their canopies are so thick that they practically form a roof over the street. My school was a 3-story building right next to these trees, and by the time my evening class started, Usually around 6:30 or 7 p.m., the school was entirely deserted. The courtyard was pitch black except for maybe 4 or 5 tall floodlights pointing down at the flagpole where our small class of maybe 10 or 12 kids would line up to practice. Everything outside of that circle of light was just an abyss. The branches of those massive French trees draped over the walls, casting these long, jagged shadows that looked like skeletal fingers reaching toward the courtyard. My dad didn't stick around to watch. He'd just drop me off, hand me over to the instructor, and leave. I remember my very first night. We were doing basic punching drills, standing in rows, when I got completely distracted by this sound. It was the birds. Now in the city you hear birds all the time during the day, but at night, it's supposed to be quiet. But up in those massive trees, there was this frantic, high-pitched screeching. It wasn't a normal bird song. It sounded panicked. It sounded like they were in pain. Just this chaotic, overlapping chorus of shrieks. I stopped punching and looked up past the floodlights toward the 3rd floor of the school. The roof of the building was a few feet lower than the top of the tree canopy, and as I was squinting into the dark, I saw them. Dozens of birds. They were swooping down from the branches in these erratic, aggressive dive bombs, heading straight for the top floor of the school. But they weren't landing. I watched, completely paralyzed, as 3 of them flew full speed, head first into the concrete wall near the roof. It wasn't a graze. I heard the sickening wet thud over the sound of the wind. Just smack. And then they dropped like stones, hitting the concrete courtyard a few yards away from us with this heavy, fleshy slap. The other birds didn't stop. A few of them swooped down and started frantically pecking at the bodies of the dead ones on the ground, almost like they were checking if they were alive. And when they realized they weren't, they just flew back up into the dark and started screaming again. I was terrified, but my brain instantly started doing that thing where you try to force logic onto something impossible. I told myself it was just light pollution. Yeah, that had to be it. I remembered reading somewhere that city lights mess with birds' navigation systems, so they were probably just blinded by the floodlights and couldn't see the wall. It was sad, but it was just nature being stupid. I tried to push it out of my mind. When the class ended and we were waiting for our parents, I started walking toward the edge of the light to look at the dead birds, but our instructor completely snapped at me. He told me to stay in the light and not go wandering around in the dark. Then I watched him walk over to the old security guard, who was sitting in his little booth, and whisper something. The guard just sighed, grabbed a push broom and a dustpan, and walked over to the shadows with a flashlight. He swept up the little bodies like they were just pieces of trash, dumping them into a black bin before my dad arrived. I told my dad about it on the ride home, and he basically fed me the exact same rationalization I had come up with. He said birds have terrible night vision, and they just crashed. Nothing to worry about. But it wasn't a one-time thing. I had class 3 nights a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And for 2 straight weeks, it happened every single freaking time. It became this routine of absolute dread. I would be standing there in my white uniform, punching the air, and my stomach would just tie into knots the second I heard that frantic chirping start up in the canopy. And then, without fail, I'd hear it. The screaming, the dive bombing, and then that wet, heavy smack against the 3rd floor wall. Sometimes it was 1 bird, sometimes it was 5. But every single night, those birds threw themselves at that specific spot on the building until they died, and every single night, the guard would shuffle out with his broom and sweep them away. It was absolute bullshit. Animals don't just commit mass suicide like that, night after night, in the exact same spot. I was getting so anxious that I couldn't even focus on the martial arts. I just kept staring up at the dark windows of the 3rd floor, wondering what the hell was pulling them in. Things finally hit a breaking point in my 3rd week. Our instructor had some sort of emergency. Maybe a family thing, or maybe he just wanted to go drink. I don't know, but he ended class about 10 minutes early. He told us to sit on the benches near the security booth while we waited for our parents, and then he hopped on his motorbike and took off. The security guard was supposed to be watching us, but he was this old, checked-out guy who just pulled his glasses down his nose and buried his face in a newspaper, totally ignoring us, Of course, the oldest kid in our class, this fifth grader, who always acted like he owned the place, saw an opportunity. The birds had just done their nightly kamikaze dive a few minutes prior, and the guard hadn't swept them up yet. The fifth grader smirked and dared us to go look at the bodies with him, joking that we should take them home and grill them. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay under the light, but peer pressure is a hell of a drug when you're 8 years old, so I followed him and a couple of other kids to the edge of the courtyard, right where the shadows swallowed the concrete. We had to squint to see, but kids have unnaturally good night vision. When my eyes adjusted, my stomach violently lurched into my throat. There were 4 birds on the ground, but they weren't just dead from hitting a wall. They were destroyed. There were feathers and blood splattered in a 2-foot radius. One of them had its neck bent at an angle that shouldn't be physically possible, and another one was completely burst open, its insides spilling out onto the pavement. It looked like something had caught them mid-air and physically crushed them in a giant fist before throwing them at the ground. The smell of raw, metallic blood and rotting leaves was so strong, I actually gagged. While I was staring at the gore, trying not to throw up, the fifth grader suddenly gasped and scrambled backward, pointing up at the building. His face was completely drained of color, just ghost white. He started stammering, pointing a shaking finger at the 3rd floor, swearing to God that he saw a man standing up there by the windows, looking down at us. The other kids immediately started making fun of him, saying he was just trying to scare us, pointing out that the school was completely locked up and all the teachers were gone. I didn't see anyone up there, but the sheer unadulterated terror in that older kid's eyes was so contagious that I almost wet myself. We all sprinted back to the light just as the security guard finally yelled at us to sit down and shut up. When my dad picked me up that night, I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I was trembling so hard my teeth were clicking together. That night, the nightmare started. I can still see it so vividly it makes my skin crawl. In the dream, I was trapped in the school courtyard, but there were no floodlights. It was pitch black, and I was running because there was this massive, towering shadow, easily 10 feet tall, chasing me around the perimeter. But the absolute worst part, the part that makes me want to rip my own ears off just thinking about it, was the sound of the birds. In the waking world, their chirping was annoying, but in the dream, it was deafening. It was this chaotic, ear-piercing cacophony of shrieks, vibrating inside my actual skull, and I could feel the birds dive-bombing my head, their cold claws tangling in my hair, their beaks tearing at my scalp, while that massive shadow just glided closer and closer. I woke up screaming, thrashing around in my tangled bedsheets, completely drenched in a cold, sour sweat. I begged my parents the next morning. I literally dropped to my knees and begged them not to make me go back to that class. I told them I was terrified, that I'd rather let Keegan beat me to a pulp every single day than go back to that dark courtyard. But my dad just brushed it off. He told me I was being dramatic, that I probably just watched a scary movie, and that I wasn't going to quit just because I had a bad dream. So I had to go back. For a whole month, I lived in a state of constant, suffocating dread. I would go to the class, clench my jaw, try to ignore the sickening thuds of the birds dying in the dark, and then I would go home and have the exact same nightmare. Every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, the shadow chasing me, the birds tearing at my flesh, the suffocating darkness. It completely broke me physically. I stopped eating. I lost what little weight I had left. I started getting these aggressive, burning fevers that would leave me shivering on the bathroom floor. Finally, my mom couldn't take it anymore. She saw me wasting away, and her maternal intuition kicked in. She told my dad that something was deeply wrong, that kids don't just consistently lie about the exact same nightmare for a month straight while their health deteriorates. She decided to pull me out of the class. The relief I felt when she told me I didn't have to go back was indescribable. It was like I could finally breathe again. A few days later, after my fever broke, My mom walked me to school for my regular daytime classes, but she didn't leave. She marched straight into the principal's office to officially withdraw me from the after-school program and, I guess, to demand some answers about what the hell was going on in that courtyard. I didn't know what they talked about until lunchtime. When the bell rang for the midday break, I walked out of my classroom and found my mom and the female principal waiting for me in the hallway. The principal had this incredibly sad, pitying look on her face. She patted my head, and then, without explaining anything, she and my mom led me toward the main stairwell. Instead of going down to the exit, we went up. We walked all the way up to the 3rd floor. I had never been up there before. It was the oldest part of the building, and it was dead silent compared to the chaos of the kids playing downstairs. They walked me to the very end of the corridor, right to the corner room that faced those massive French trees. The wooden sign above the door said, Class 5-3, but it wasn't a classroom. The door was wide open, and the room was completely hollowed out. There were no desks, no chairs, no chalkboard. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and the corners were choked with heavy cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But at the very back of the room, positioned perfectly to look out the window toward the courtyard, was a wooden altar. It was an old, intricately carved shrine. There were no photographs on it, just a wooden tablet with faded Chinese characters etched into it. Sitting in front of the tablet was a heavy brass incense burner, and there were 3 sticks of incense actively burning in it. The thick, fragrant smoke was curling up into the stale air. The principal walked over to the windowsill, picked up a cheap plastic lighter and a fresh pack of incense. She lit 3 sticks, handed them to me, and gently told me to pay my respects. I didn't understand what I was doing, but the heavy, oppressive energy in that room made me compliant. I held the incense, bowed my head, and placed them in the ash. From where I stood at the altar, I could look straight out the window. The dense, sprawling branches of the ancient trees were maybe 15 feet away. I could hear the birds fluttering around out there in the harsh daylight. It felt so uncomfortably close. We left after that. My mom enrolled me in a different martial arts center miles away, and I never set foot in that school courtyard after dark ever again. It wasn't until a few years later that I finally overheard my parents talking about it in the kitchen, and the puzzle pieces finally clicked together in a way that makes me sick to my stomach to this day. That wooden tablet? It belonged to a man named Mr. Quach. Long before the government took over the land to build a public school, that entire plot of real estate belonged to him. He was a wealthy Chinese landowner from the old days, and he had died on that very property. The school had tried to use that corner room on the 3rd floor as a regular classroom for years, but things kept happening. I don't know the details, but it was bad enough that multiple generations of principals, government-appointed officials who weren't supposed to believe in this kind of stuff, eventually gave up. They cleared out the room, set up the altar, and surrendered that space back to Mr. Quach. He was the landlord, and he never left. For the most part, he left the students alone during the day. We were just passing through, but the night belonged to him. And for whatever twisted, incomprehensible reason, he hated the birds. Or maybe he just liked torturing them. Maybe he was the one pulling them from the trees, messing with their heads, forcing them to crash into his wall over and over again just for his own sick entertainment. I realized later why I always saw maintenance workers painting over that specific section of the exterior wall every couple of months. The pale yellow paint was always fresh in that one spot near the roof, covering up the dark, rusty stains of dried blood that accumulated night after night. I still think about it all the time. I think about how close I was to whatever was standing in that window. I think about the fact that if I hadn't gotten sick, I would have kept standing in that dark courtyard, letting whatever invisible frequency that was driving those birds insane wash over me too. It makes me wonder, have any of you ever lived near a really old property and noticed the local wildlife acting completely unnatural? Like dogs barking at empty corners, or birds just dropping dead out of the sky for no reason? If you have, I really need you to tell me about it in the comments, because I need to know I'm not the only one who realizes that sometimes the things that haunt us aren't even interested in us, we're just trespassing in their space. If you're walking home tonight, especially near any old trees, just keep your head down, don't look up into the branches. You really don't want to know what's looking back down at you. actually teach at a university now, which makes looking back on this whole thing feel incredibly surreal. Almost like a twisted joke that the universe is playing on me. Don't worry, the campus where I lecture today is perfectly fine, completely normal, and I've never felt so much as a cold draft in the hallways. But the place where I got my degree, the place where I actually experienced this, that's a completely different story. I'm gonna change a few names here just to protect my own job, but let's just say my name is Cade. And back then, I was a senior at a pretty massive food industry university over in Tanfu. This happened maybe 6 or 7 years ago, back when I was in my 4th year. You know how college is. It's not like high school where you sit at the same desk in the same room all year round. You're constantly migrating, dragging your tired body from building to building depending on the subject. And there was this one specific lecture hall on the ground floor of an older building that I had only been in maybe 3 or 4 times since I was a freshman. It was just one of those generic, echoey rooms, with heavy wooden desks bolted to the floor, and fluorescent lights that always seemed to have a faint, annoying buzz to them. It was a completely unremarkable Tuesday, and I was hanging out with 2 of my buddies after our morning class finished up right around 11. We were packing up our bags, fully intending to head out, when I pulled out my phone to double-check my schedule for the week. My stomach instantly dropped when I realized that we actually had another class, in that exact same room, starting at 1 in the afternoon. I showed my phone to my friends, and we all just let out this collective groan of pure exhaustion. Back then, we were broke. And I don't mean just tightly budgeted college students. I mean we were scraping the bottom of the barrel, rural kids trying to survive in the big city where spending even $2 or $3 on a cheap iced coffee at a cafe, just to kill time, felt like a massive financial burden. We didn't want to go to an internet cafe. We didn't want to walk around in the blistering midday heat. And honestly, even starting up our motorbikes to go anywhere felt like a waste of precious gas money. So, being the lazy, perpetually exhausted seniors that we were, I suggested that we just pull a few tables together in the back of the classroom and sleep right there until the afternoon session started. My buddies agreed instantly, completely worn out from their part-time shifts the night before. We pushed these heavy wooden desks together to make a makeshift bed, tossing our backpacks down as pillows. Before I laid down, I made sure to set an alarm on my phone for 12:30. I specifically chose that time because I wanted to give us a solid 30 minutes to wake up, wipe the drool off our faces, and push the desks back into their proper rows before the girls in our class started walking in. Because let's be real, it's kind of embarrassing to be caught sleeping like a bunch of homeless guys by the girls you're trying to impress. I passed out pretty fast. The room was stuffy, but that deep fatigue just pulled me under. When my phone alarm finally started blaring its default chime at 12:30, it felt like I had only closed my eyes for 5 seconds. I groaned, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, and sat up, stretching my stiff back. I kicked the legs of my 2 friends, telling them to get up so we could arrange the furniture, but they just swatted my feet away, groaning and begging for just 5 more minutes. They were completely dead to the world. I rolled my eyes, feeling that familiar annoyance of being the only responsible one in the group, but I decided to let them sleep for a few more minutes. I grabbed my phone, walked up to the very front of the classroom, and sat down at the first row of desks just to scroll through social media and wake my brain up. Now, I need to explain the layout of this specific spot so you understand why my brain tried so hard to rationalize what happened next. Right next to the front entrance of our classroom, sharing the same wall, was this old storage room. It had these heavy, industrial double doors made of solid steel, painted a chipped, faded green. From where I was sitting at the front desk, all I had to do was glance slightly to my left through the open doorway of our classroom, and I had a clear, unobstructed view of those metal storage doors. I was just mindlessly scrolling, probably looking at some dumb meme, when the heavy midday silence of the campus was suddenly interrupted by this dull, rhythmic thudding noise. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was a slow, deliberate sound, vibrating right through the thin walls and into the floorboards under my sneakers, almost like a heavy fist wrapped in cloth was rhythmically striking the metal door from the inside. Thud, thud, thud. I paused, lowering my phone, and tilted my head toward the hallway. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the university wasn't completely abandoned, but it was incredibly sparse. You might have a few random kids sitting on stone benches outside, or someone napping in a distant corridor, but the immediate vicinity was dead quiet. I leaned over my desk, sticking my head out just enough to look at the storage room doors. The double doors were shut, secured right in the center by this massive, heavy-duty brass padlock that linked the two metal handles together. But as I watched, the center of the doors suddenly buckled outward with a metallic groan, as if someone inside had just thrown their shoulder against the gap. The padlock strained, stretching the metal loops it was hooked through to their absolute limit, before the door snapped back flush with the frame. Then it happened again. The doors bulged out, the padlock clanked tightly against the steel, and then they snapped back. My immediate thought, the absolute first place my tired brain went to, was that some stupid freshmen were playing a prank, or someone had accidentally gotten locked inside while looking for supplies. I mean, it was a university, not a haunted house, so obviously there was a logical explanation. I was just about to stand up and go see if they needed me to call campus security. When the bulging stopped, I kept my eyes locked on the gap between the doors. The padlock was still hanging there, securing the handles, but then, incredibly slowly, the right side of the metal door began to creak open. It only opened about a hand span, maybe 6 or 7 inches, just enough to slip a face through. And that's exactly what happened. From the pitch-black darkness of that storage room, a girl's head poked out into the bright hallway light. She looked like a typical student, maybe 19 or 20, with this very distinct, heavy, blunt-cut fringe, which was a super popular hairstyle around here several years ago. Her skin was incredibly pale, almost chalky, but the thing that stood out the most were her eyes. They were completely round, wide, and staring straight ahead like glass marbles. She didn't look at me. She didn't scream for help. She just slowly swiveled her neck, looking up the hallway, then down the hallway, with this blank, terrifyingly empty expression on her face. Then, without making a single sound, she pulled her head back into the darkness, and the heavy metal door gently clicked shut. I just sat there, blinking. My heart had done a weird little flutter, but I forcefully pushed the unease down into the pit of my stomach. My brain immediately started weaving this complex net of excuses. I told myself that it was probably just a group of female students who had snuck into an empty room to sleep privately, and she was just poking her head out to check the time or see if the hallways were getting busy. I mean, we were sleeping in a classroom. Why couldn't they sleep in the storage room? Sure, it was weird, but college kids do weird stuff. I convinced myself I was just being a creep for staring, so I pulled my eyes away, hunched back over my desk, and forced myself to focus on my phone screen. But my hands were slightly clammy, and the air in the room suddenly felt suffocatingly still. Maybe a minute passed, not even 2 full minutes, and then the door exploded. A deafening, violent crash echoed through the hallway, making my entire body jolt violently in my chair. It sounded like someone was taking a sledgehammer to the inside of the steel doors. The relentless, concussive booming was so intense that the acoustic tiles in the ceiling above me actually vibrated. I whipped my head around, my breathing suddenly shallow, and stared at the storage room. The heavy doors were bowing outward violently under the immense pressure of whatever was hitting them, and the massive brass padlock on the outside was bouncing and clanking frantically against the metal surface. And right then, right at that exact fraction of a second, my logical brain completely shattered. I saw the padlock. It was on the outside. It was fully locked, fully engaged, securing the 2 handles together. If the padlock was locked on the outside, how in the absolute hell did that girl open the door 6 inches just 2 minutes ago? How did she stick her head out if the heavy brass lock was physically binding the 2 panels together? And more importantly, if someone was trapped inside and panicking enough to hit the door that hard, why weren't they screaming? There was no voice, no cries for help, just the cold, mechanical, flesh-tearing thud against the steel. A wave of pure, primal nausea hit me. I felt like I was going to throw up. My legs moved before my brain gave the order, driven by some stupid, ingrained instinct to investigate, to be the hero, to figure out what the hell was going on. I stepped out of the classroom, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, and took a few hesitant steps toward the storage room. I was maybe 6 feet away. The violent banging stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute it made my ears ring. I stared at the center of the doors. The heavy brass padlock was gone. It wasn't broken. It wasn't hanging open. It was completely, physically erased from reality. Before I could even process that impossibility, the right side of the metal door began to creak open again, exactly like before, one slow, agonizing inch at a time, until there was about a hand span of empty space. My lungs completely seized up. I couldn't pull air in. I just stood there, paralyzed, watching the darkness in the crack. And then she pushed her head out again. It was the same girl, the same blunt, dark bangs. But this time, oh God, her face. The entire left side of her face was caved inward, completely crushed into a pulpy, dark red crater that looked like it had been forcefully compressed in a vise. The bone structure beneath entirely obliterated so that her cheekbone was just gone, replaced by a sunken, glistening hollow of ruined flesh. But the most horrifying part, the part that makes me wake up in a cold sweat even years later, were her eyes. Because her face was crushed, the skin around her left eye had been pulled back or torn away, completely removing her eyelids. The eyeball itself was fully exposed, bulging out of its socket, utterly unprotected, and locked in a wide, unblinking state of absolute trauma. The wet, coppery smell of old blood hit the back of my throat, making me gag. But I couldn't look away. I was trapped in this state of sheer terror, and my brain, desperately trying to protect my sanity, forcefully dragged my focus away from the gore and locked my eyes onto a tiny, shiny silver hairpin holding back a piece of her bloody hair. It was perfectly clean. The silver clip was completely pristine. I just stared at that little piece of metal while the mangled, mutilated ruin of a human being swiveled her neck, looking up and down the hallway with that same blank, empty curiosity. She never looked at me. I was standing less than 6 feet away, completely exposed, but it was like I didn't even exist in her dimension. Then, she slowly dragged her head back into the pitch black, and the heavy steel door clicked shut. What the fuck? The whisper tore out of my dry throat completely involuntarily, my voice cracking under the sheer pressure of the adrenaline flooding my system. Hey, Cade, what are you doing standing out there staring at the wall? The sudden, groggy voice from inside the classroom made me jump so hard I nearly bit through my own tongue. I spun around, gasping for air, to see my two buddies finally sitting up from the desks, rubbing their eyes and stretching. I whipped my head back toward the storage room. The heavy brass padlock was hanging right there, dead center, locked tight, completely undisturbed. I stumbled back into the classroom, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them against my thighs. I started stammering, the words tumbling out of my mouth in this frantic, disjointed mess, trying to explain the banging, the missing lock, the girl with the crushed face. My friends just stared at me like I had lost my goddamn mind. They laughed, telling me I was clearly sleep-deprived from my part-time job, that I probably had a waking nightmare, or was just hallucinating from the heat. They completely dismissed me, telling me to grab a desk and start arranging the room before the professor showed up. I felt this isolating, suffocating wave of helplessness wash over me. I wasn't crazy. I know what I saw. Just then, I heard the heavy, rhythmic clacking of leather boots echoing down the hallway. It was the older campus security guard, walking his midday route to flip the breaker switches and cut the power to empty rooms to save electricity. I practically sprinted out of the classroom, cutting him off in the hallway, wildly pointing at the storage room doors. I frantically tried to explain that something was wrong, that someone or something was locked in there, and the door was acting crazy. The guard didn't even look surprised. He just looked incredibly tired. He let out this deep, heavy sigh that seemed to carry years of exhaustion. He walked over to the storage room, grabbed the heavy brass padlock, gave it a few firm tugs to ensure it was secure, and then turned back to me with a stern, warning glare. He ordered us to go back inside our classroom, telling us to stop spreading stupid rumors unless we wanted to get suspended by the administration. He treated it like an annoyance, like a leaking pipe he had to deal with every week. We were officially put in our place, so we dragged the desks back into rows just as the other students started trickling in for the 1 o'clock session. I sat down, my mind completely numb, unable to process the absolute violation of reality I had just witnessed. About 15 minutes into the lecture, while the professor was writing on the board, I glanced out the open door and saw the security guard walk by again. But this time, he was holding a thick plastic package. He ripped the cardboard backing off, pulled out a brand new, shiny brass padlock, walked over to the storage room, and swapped out the old one. Why would he replace a perfectly good lock? I must have been staring with my jaw unhinged, because the guy sitting next to me, a senior who had taken a lot more classes in this specific building than I had, nudged me hard in the ribs. He leaned in close, keeping his voice to a barely audible whisper, and warned me that staring at that room was a good way to get something attached to me. I turned to him, my skin crawling, and asked him if the rumors about the ghost were actually true. He gave a grim little nod and told me to check the old university forums, the ones the admins were always trying to scrub. Apparently, several years prior, a junior girl had gotten entangled in a deeply messy, secretive affair with one of the married professors. When the wife found out, and the whole thing blew up, threatening her entire future and reputation, the girl couldn't handle it. During the quiet lunch break, when the campus was dead, she hid inside that room, which actually used to be a regular classroom before they converted it, and ended her own life. The guy looked at me, dead in the eyes, and said, "She's trapped in there, man. They say if you stay in the halls during lunch, you can hear her trying to break out. The banging gets so violent that she actually shatters the internal mechanisms of those heavy padlocks. That's why the guards have to replace them every month. She physically breaks them from the inside." Looking back on it now, sitting in my own office as an adult, that's the part that truly haunts me. It's the physical evidence that breaks my brain. It's one thing to see a ghost. It's one thing to have a hallucination fueled by heat and exhaustion. But what happens when the hallucination leaves physical damage? I keep picturing that brand new padlock being ripped out of its plastic packaging. The school administration knows. The guards know. They literally have a budget allocated to replacing the locks that a dead girl destroys in her endless looping panic. And it makes me wonder, when she opened that door and peeked out with that mutilated face, was she looking for her professor? Or was she just blindly searching for a way out of a loop she can never escape? Has anyone listening to this ever gone to a university with a secret like that? A place where the staff just quietly cleans up the mess of a haunting without ever acknowledging it? Have you ever found a physical object that proved your absolute worst nightmare was actually real? Because I swear, that realization is 1,000 times worse than the jump scare itself. If you are currently a college student, especially if you're taking summer classes or staying on campus during those quiet, empty hours, please, trust your gut. If you hear a noise that shouldn't be there, don't try to be the hero. And don't try to find a logical explanation. Just pack your bags and leave. I hope you never have to find out what happens when the lock on the door finally gives way entirely. I don't know if anyone listening to this has ever been, I guess the word is, sheltered. Like severely, almost dangerously sheltered, to the point where your brain literally doesn't know how to process a threat when it's staring you right in the face. If you have, or if you've ever experienced something so bizarre that your mind just tries to gaslight you into thinking it's normal, please let me know in the comments, because for the longest time, I thought I was just fundamentally broken. I really need to know I'm not the only one who reacts to pure terror with just dumb confusion. This happened back when I was in 10th grade. So, just to give you some context, my family was pretty well off. Actually, really well off. I'm not saying this to brag, but you have to understand my mindset back then. I was an only child. and my parents basically treated me like this fragile piece of glass. I was driven everywhere in a private car. I never had to walk the streets alone. I never really had to deal with conflict. I was bubble-wrapped. I was academically smart, but my emotional intelligence, my street smarts, they were basically zero. I was incredibly naive. So, I attended this massive international school in District 6, which is this area where you have these hyper-modern, sterile compounds right next to chaotic, noisy streets. I had been going there as a day student for about 2 years, and everything was fine. But then, I went through this mild rebellious phase. And when I say rebellious, I mean I probably just talked back to my mom once or twice, or stayed up a little late, and my parents completely overreacted. They decided I needed discipline, and forced me to become a boarding student at the exact same school. The crazy part was, my house was only about 3 miles away. I was living 3 miles away, but I was locked in this dorm. The boarding rules at this school were insane. It felt more like a minimum security prison than a high-end school. By 9 p.m. every single night, all the boarding students had to be in their assigned rooms. And these were big rooms, like 20 girls to a room, and each room had a dorm mother, basically a nanny who watched over us. I had the absolute worst luck and got assigned to Miss Quinn. She was this incredibly strict, no-nonsense woman who looked like she could snap a clipboard in half with her bare hands. The weirdest rule they had was about the bathrooms. At 9 p.m., you were locked in. The lights went out at 9:30 p.m. If you needed to use the restroom, Miss Quinn would ask everyone at 8:30 p.m., and she would literally herd us down the hall, into the elevator, down to the second floor where the big bathrooms were, and stand guard outside like we were toddlers. If you didn't go then, you held it until morning. There were no exceptions, no wandering the halls at night. At the time, we all complained about it. We just thought it was the school being overly controlling, a bunch of bureaucratic crap to keep us in line. We had no idea why the rule actually existed. So, it was a Tuesday night. At 8:30 p.m., Miss Quinn did her usual call for the bathroom. I was lying in my bed reading a magazine or something, and I didn't have to go. I was feeling lazy. The room was cozy, and I just couldn't be bothered to join the line. But of course, right around 10:14 p.m., I remember looking at the glowing red numbers on my digital alarm clock. It hit me, and it wasn't just a mild urge. It was this sudden, agonizing pressure, like my bladder was going to burst. I started tossing and turning, trying to ignore it, but it was impossible. I leaned over and whispered to my roommate that I needed to pee so badly I was in pain, and she just looked at me like I was dead meat, telling me that if I woke Miss Quinn up now, she would absolutely destroy me. I was lying there, sweating, trying to hold it, when a miracle happened. Around 10:19 p.m., Miss Quinn's cell phone buzzed. She answered it, whispering harshly, and from what I could gather, someone, maybe a relative or a delivery driver, was waiting for her down at the main gate. She sighed, grabbed her shawl, and slipped out of the room. And she didn't click the door completely shut. It was left open, just a crack. My brain instantly went into survival mode. But like, the dumb kind. I figured this was my only window. I would sneak out, take the elevator down to the second floor, pee in record time, and be back in bed before she even made it back up from the gate. I slipped out of bed, crept through the dark room, trying not to step on anyone's shoes, and pushed out into the hallway. The fourth floor was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, where the hum of the air conditioning sounds like a jet engine. I practically jogged to the elevator, pressed the button, and took it down to the second floor. I ran into the girls' bathroom. The facilities there were really nice. Everything was marble and chrome, and it always smelled intensely of artificial pine and bleach. I went into a stall, did my business as fast as humanly possible, flushed, and rushed out to the sinks. As I was washing my hands, I looked through the reflection in the mirror and noticed the bathroom door was propped open, and right outside in the hallway, there was a janitor. She was an older woman, wearing the school's maintenance uniform, which honestly looked more like a high-end hotel receptionist outfit, really crisp, dark blue, very professional. Her hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and she was slowly pushing a wet mop across the tiles. It was late, way past when the cleaning crew usually worked, but I was so panicked about getting caught by Miss Quinn that I didn't even process the timing. The school had this incredibly strict policy that students had to cross their arms and bow slightly to greet any staff member. Teachers, guards, janitors, didn't matter. But I was in such a rush, and I knew I wasn't supposed to be out of my room, so I just kept my head down, scurried past her without saying a word, and power walked to the elevator. I hit the call button. The doors slid open immediately. I stepped inside and jammed my finger against the button for the 4th floor, and then started aggressively tapping the door close button because I just wanted to get back to my bed. The heavy metal doors started to slide shut, and then they stopped. The sensors caught something, and they rolled back open. The janitor stepped into the elevator with me. She was still holding her mop, staring straight ahead at the metal doors. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me. I felt a little guilty for not greeting her earlier, so I just pressed myself into the corner, staring at the floor indicator above the door. I had pressed 4. The little 4 button was glowing bright orange, but the elevator didn't go up. I felt that weird dropping sensation in my stomach as the mechanics kicked in, and the digital display flickered. Instead of going to 3, the arrow pointed down. The number changed to 1, and then down to G, for the ground floor. I remember frowning, thinking it was just a glitch, like maybe she had called the elevator from the ground floor before I got in, and the system was prioritizing her trip. My naive brain immediately started making up excuses for the machine. The elevator settled with a soft jolt at the ground floor. The door slid open to the dark lobby. The janitor stepped out, and this is the part where my brain should have sounded the alarm, but it didn't. As she walked out into the lobby, there was no sound. None. She was pushing a heavy industrial mop bucket and walking on hard marble floors, but there was no squeak of rubber soles. No sloshing water, no metallic rattling, just absolute dead silence. She moved with this slow, mechanical glide, almost like she was on a track. She stepped out, and the elevator doors slid shut behind her. I was alone again. I exhaled, feeling totally weirded out, and quickly pressed the button for the 4th floor again. The orange light glowed. The elevator hummed. The arrow pointed up, and we started ascending. Ground, 1st floor, and then the elevator stopped. It gave this dull ding, and the numbers locked onto the 2nd floor. I groaned internally, thinking someone else was out past curfew. The doors slowly parted, and my heart almost stopped. I was looking directly across the hallway at the open door of the girls' bathroom, and walking out of that bathroom, pushing her mop with the exact same slow, rhythmic motion, was the exact same janitor. She walked out of the bathroom, turned, and stepped right into the elevator with me. My mind just completely short-circuited. I was standing there, pressed against the cold metal wall, staring at the side of her face. It was her, the exact same crisp blue uniform, the exact same tight ponytail, the exact same grip on the mop handle. My brain, my incredibly sheltered, rationalizing brain, went into overdrive trying to build a logical bridge over this massive hole in reality. I literally told myself, I convinced myself in that moment, that she must have realized she forgot a cleaning spray or a sponge, and she had sprinted up the back stairwell to the 2nd floor, grabbed it, and was now taking the elevator back down. I ignored the fact that no human being could climb 2 flights of stairs faster than an elevator. I ignored the fact that she wasn't breathing heavily, wasn't sweating, and looked completely undisturbed. I forced myself to believe the impossible physics because the alternative was something my mind couldn't handle. The doors closed, and once again, even though the 4th floor button was still glowing, the elevator went down. The arrow flipped. 2, 1, ground. The panic was starting to curdle in my stomach now. My mouth tasted like copper. I was gripping the handrail so tight my knuckles were white. This wasn't a glitch. Something was fundamentally wrong with the space I was in. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened into the dim lobby. The janitor stepped out. I immediately started hammering the door close button. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to be locked inside a metal box away from her. I was hitting the button so fast, over and over, my breath hitching in my throat, just begging the doors to shut, but they were slow. So agonizingly slow. I watched the janitor walk out through the narrowing gap of the doors. She took 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, and then she fell. But it wasn't a normal trip or a stumble. It was the most unnatural, horrifying collapse I have ever witnessed. Her body just gave out. It folded in on itself like a marionette with its strings violently severed. She hit the marble floor face first, and again, there was no sound. A human body hitting solid stone should make a sickening thud. The heavy metal mop handle bounced against the tiles, but it was completely mute. It was like I was watching a horrific video on mute. She lay there on her stomach, utterly motionless, but her arms were bent at these grotesque, impossible angles, reaching up towards her head in a frozen state of agony. The elevator doors were still open. I was frozen. This is where my upbringing actively fought against my survival instinct. Any normal person would have slammed the buttons, screamed, or ran. But my brain, programmed with years of etiquette and obedience, whispered to me that a school staff member had just collapsed, and it was my duty to help her. If I left her there, and Miss Quinn found out, I'd be expelled. My whole body was trembling. I was shaking so hard my teeth were clicking together, but I forced my legs to move. I took a step out of the elevator. I was maybe 2 feet away from her motionless body, reaching my hand out, trying to force my throat to form words to ask if she was okay, when a voice shattered the silence like a gunshot. "Tegan, what in God's name are you doing out of bed?" I jumped out of my skin. I spun around, and standing near the main entrance gates, holding a small plastic bag of what looked like medicine or food, was Miss Quinn. Her face was twisted in absolute fury. She started marching toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble. She was demanding to know why I was on the ground floor at 10:30 at night, asking if I was trying to sneak out of the compound, completely ignoring the collapsed woman right in front of me. I was crying at this point. I was so overwhelmed by fear and the threat of trouble, I frantically pointed down at the floor, sobbing, trying to stammer out that the janitor had fallen, that she was hurt, that I was just trying to help her. Miss Quinn stopped in her tracks. She looked down at where I was pointing, and her expression changed from angry to utterly disgusted. She looked at me and asked what the hell I was talking about, telling me there was absolutely no one there, and that lying to get out of trouble was the worst offense I could commit. I snapped my head back to look at the floor. It was empty. The pristine, polished marble floor was completely fucking empty. No janitor, no mop, no bucket, not even a smudge of water on the tiles. It was just nothing. I couldn't speak. My vocal cords literally stopped working. I just stood there with my mouth open, staring at the empty space, my brain collapsing in on itself. Miss Quinn didn't care. She grabbed my arm, pinching my ear just a little to assert dominance, and physically dragged me back into the elevator. She hit the button for the 4th floor, and of course, this time, it went straight up. Normal. Flawless. She marched me back to the dorm, shoved me into my bed, and told me I was getting a massive detention in the morning. I didn't care about the detention. I pulled my blanket up to my nose and lay there in the dark. There were 19 other girls sleeping soundly all around me, breathing softly, and I had never felt more isolated in my entire life. I didn't sleep a single wink. I just lay there, tears continuously streaming down the sides of my face, soaking into my pillow. I was trapped in this paralyzing loop of terror, unable to pray, unable to rationalize, just marinating in the absolute horror of what I had seen. I stayed completely rigid until the sun came up at 6 a.m. The second recess hit, I practically sprinted to the school's payphones. I used whatever change I had, called my mom, and the moment I heard her voice say hello, I completely broke down. I was screaming, crying, begging her to come get me, acting like a complete maniac. Because we lived so close, my parents were at the school gates in less than 20 minutes. They stormed into the administration office, pulling the wealthy, angry parent card, demanding to know what happened to me. They pulled my homeroom teacher into the meeting. And the teacher, she looked exhausted. She didn't try to gaslight me. She didn't say I was hallucinating. She sat my parents down and explained that about a decade ago, right after the school had been built, there was a janitor who worked the late shifts. One night, while cleaning the second-floor bathrooms, she felt unwell. She took the elevator down to the ground floor to seek help from the security guards, but as she stepped out of the elevator, she suffered a massive, fatal stroke. She collapsed right there in the lobby and died before the ambulance even arrived. The teacher explained that what I saw wasn't a ghost trying to attack me. I had just, somehow, for whatever reason, tuned into a residual loop. I had witnessed the last 3 minutes of that poor woman's life, playing out over and over again like a broken VHS tape. My parents didn't even wait for the end of the day. They packed up my room, withdrew my enrollment, and transferred me to a completely different day school in another district by the end of the week. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. The thought that completely ruins me even years later. What if Miss Quinn hadn't shouted my name when she did? I was inches away from touching her. My hand was reaching out to grab her shoulder, to pull her up. If I had made physical contact with that echo, what would have happened? Would my hand have passed right through her empty air? Or worse, would I have been pulled into her loop? Would I be stuck in that sterile, silent elevator, riding down to the ground floor, watching her die, over and over and over again for the rest of eternity? I still live in the city, and occasionally, I have to drive past District 6 at night. Every time I see the lights of that international school glowing in the distance, I immediately lock my car doors, and my hands start sweating against the steering wheel. I have this irrational terror that if I stop at a red light too long, I'll look over at the crosswalk and see a woman in a crisp blue uniform pushing a dry mop across the asphalt in dead silence. I'm an English professor. I've been teaching for a very, very long time, and I need to preface this by saying that I am a deeply logical person. I'm also Catholic, and on top of my regular university lectures, I used to take on extra work teaching English to poor students at local Catholic parishes. I was always busy, always grounded in reality, which means my brain just naturally filters out a lot of the local superstitions. Where I lived, people talked about ghosts and curses all the time, but I always just nodded politely and went to Sunday Mass. I didn't care about spirits. I cared about lesson plans, grading papers, and keeping my students awake. But back in 2003, I took a new position at a university in Saigon, specifically in Bintan district. It was a massive campus, walled off, kind of operating like an old government compound. The very first weird thing happened before I even officially started my regular classes. It was November 20th, which is Teachers' Day over there. It's a huge deal. The university threw this massive outdoor buffet in the main courtyard for all the staff and students. I remember the exact atmosphere. It was around 7 p.m., and the courtyard was absolutely swarming with people. It was loud, chaotic. The air was thick with the smell of fried food, cheap perfume, and that damp, suffocating humidity that makes your clothes stick to your back. It was stuffy, too many bodies breathing the same air. But then, as I was standing near the edge of the crowd, waiting to grab a plate, the temperature just plummeted. And I don't mean a cool evening breeze. I mean a damp, unnatural freeze that started right in my armpits and crept up the back of my neck. It was the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I literally shivered, rubbing my arms, feeling the goosebumps prickling against the fabric of my aodai, the traditional silk dress we wear to teach. I remember thinking it was so bizarre, so completely out of place in that sweltering crowd, but I just blamed it on exhaustion. I figured I was coming down with a fever or something. So, I walked over to the buffet line. My colleague, let's call her Hazel, was standing next to me. I grabbed a plate and a fork, Not chopsticks, just a standard metal fork. I reached over to stab a piece of fried spring roll. I pushed the tines into the roll, lifted it halfway to my plate, and it just slid right off. Plop. Back into the tray. I felt my face get hot. You know that stupid, clumsy feeling when you drop food in front of a bunch of people? I nervously glanced around to see if any of my new students saw me being an idiot. I just muttered to myself that the fork must be covered in grease. So I tried again. This time, I went for a piece of sausage. I drove that fork deep into the sausage. I made absolutely sure it was secured. I even felt the metal scrape the bottom of the aluminum tray. I lifted it up, and I swear to God, the moment the fork hovered over my plate, I felt a physical tug. It wasn't gravity, it wasn't the sausage slipping. It felt exactly like someone had pinched the meat between their thumb and forefinger and violently yanked it downward. The sausage didn't just fall, it launched. It shot off my fork and bounced across the table, rolling away like a golf ball. My hand actually shook from the force of it. I just stood there, staring at my empty fork, my brain completely short-circuiting. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was the oil, the angle, my tired wrists, but my stomach was tied in knots because I knew what I felt. Hazel noticed I was struggling. She sort of laughed, took the tongs, and effortlessly grabbed a bunch of food, dropping it onto her plate in 2 seconds. She even offered to get me a new fork, wiping it down with a napkin to make sure it wasn't slippery. I took it, but my hands were sweating so badly. I tried one more time. I aimed for a piece of grilled meat. I stabbed it. Hard. I lifted it, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles were white. And halfway to my plate, a heavy, invisible weight slammed down on my wrist. My whole arm jerked downward. The meat splattered back into the tray with a wet slap. The vibration shot straight up to my elbow. My heart stopped for a full second. I couldn't breathe. I just stared at the buffet table, the noise of the party completely fading out, replaced by this ringing in my ears. I tried to switch to a pair of standard bamboo chopsticks, thinking maybe the fork was just defective, but it was even worse. I couldn't grip a single piece of food. The meat kept slipping out of the wooden sticks like it was coated in thick grease, and the one time I actually managed to pinch a piece of sausage and bring it close to my mouth, that same invisible force swatted the tip of the chopsticks, dropping the food right back into the tray. I felt sick to my stomach. I gave up. I just walked away with an empty plate, trying to look normal while every instinct in my body was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. But the denial is strong, right? We do anything to protect our sanity. I sat down at a table, grabbed a paper cup of soda, and tried to laugh it off. I told myself I was just overworked. I raised the cup to take a sip. Just as the rim touched my lips, someone swatted it. I didn't see a hand, but I felt the distinct upward smack against the bottom of the cup. The soda erupted out of the plastic, splashing all over my face, my chest, ruining my silk dress. The cup flew out of my grip and clattered onto the table. People at the next table turned to look. Hazel gasped and asked what happened. I was sitting there, dripping sticky soda, my face burning with a humiliation so deep it actually hurt. I mumbled some garbage excuse about my hands cramping up from writing on the chalkboard all week. I told her I just had a spasm. But deep down, I was terrified because I didn't drop that cup. It was knocked out of my hand, deliberately, aggressively. I couldn't eat. I couldn't drink. I just sat there in my ruined dress, feeling that freezing, damp air hovering right over my shoulder for the rest of the night. I went home, took a shower, ate a cheap pack of instant noodles, because somehow I could eat perfectly fine the second I was off that campus, and convinced myself it was all just a bizarre string of bad luck. The next morning was my first official lecture. I woke up early, feeling confident again. I had been teaching for a decade. The classroom was my safe space. I had my heavy leather binder, the one I kept my handwritten lesson plans in. I had spent hours preparing it. I got to the university, walked into the classroom, smiled at the freshmen, and opened my binder to the first page. It was blank. I blinked. I flipped to the next page. Blank. I frantically flipped through the entire thick stack of paper. Every single page was completely, starkly white. Not a drop of ink. Nothing. I took my glasses off. My hands were trembling, and wiped the lenses on my shirt. I put them back on, still blank. My mind was spinning out of control. Did I grab the wrong binder? No, the leather cover had my name embossed on it. Did my kids at home accidentally swap my papers? Impossible. They were too young to even open the heavy clasps. Then I pulled out the printed textbook, a commercially published book I had bought from the store. I opened the textbook, and there was no text, just empty white pages, from cover to cover. No chapters, no page numbers, no copyright text. Nothing. I thought I was having a stroke. I genuinely thought my brain was hemorrhaging, and I was losing the cognitive ability to perceive letters. I stood there, staring at these impossible white pages, the silence in the room getting heavier and heavier as 50 students waited for me to speak. But I'm a professional. I forced myself to snap out of it. I slammed the book shut, plastered a fake smile on my face, and told the class that since it was the first day, we wouldn't use the books. We did introductions, conversation practice, icebreakers. I carried that entire 2-hour lecture entirely from memory, running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. When the class ended, I practically sprinted to my motorbike and drove straight home. I ran into my living room, unzipped my bag, pulled out the binder, and ripped it open. My handwriting was there. Every single page was completely filled with my blue ink. I pulled out the textbook. The printed letters were right where they were supposed to be. Holy shit. That was the moment my worldview actually cracked. I dropped the binder on the floor and just backed away from it. I couldn't rationalize it anymore. I couldn't blame my eyes or my fatigue. Something had actively blinded me in that classroom. Something had hidden the words from me, just to mess with my head. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was going completely insane. A few days later, the attacks shifted from psychological to physical. I had finished a morning class. It was around 10 a.m. The Saigon sun was already blistering, the kind of aggressive heat that makes the asphalt shimmer. I walked out to the university parking lot to get my motorbike. It was an old, heavy manual bike. The parking lot rules back then required you to kill the engine and push your bike out to the main gate before starting it, to keep the noise down. So, I grabbed the handles and pushed. It wouldn't budge. It felt like the tires had melted into the pavement. I pushed harder, leaning my entire body weight into it. The wheels slowly creaked forward, but it felt like I was trying to push a 2-ton boulder through wet sand. It was exactly like the brakes were completely locked, but I could see the brake lines were totally fine. I was sweating profusely, my muscles burning, panting like a dog. And right then, in the middle of this 100-degree heat wave, that damp, icy cold wrapped around me again. It slithered down my collar, freezing the sweat on my spine. My skin erupted in goosebumps. I was standing in direct sunlight, but I felt like I was locked in a meat freezer. I looked around, desperate, thinking some prankster students had messed with my bike, but the lot was mostly empty. A security guard saw me struggling and jogged over. I stepped back, panting, and told him my brakes must be jammed. The older man just grabbed the handlebars, casually pushed the bike forward with one hand, and it rolled perfectly smoothly. Not a single squeak of resistance. He looked at me like I was a fragile, hysterical woman, smiled, and even kicked the engine over for me. I thanked him, my cheeks burning with shame, and got on. I hit the throttle and shifted into first gear. The engine roared. The RPMs spiked, but the bike barely moved. I shifted to second, then third, then fourth. The engine was screaming, whining under the strain, but I was crawling forward at maybe 10 miles an hour. It felt like I was dragging a massive invisible anchor behind me. I was driving down the busy streets of Saigon, traffic honking and flying past me, while I moved at the speed of a dying bicycle. The sheer dread that washed over me is impossible to describe. I was terrified to look in my rearview mirrors. I had this sickening, gut-wrenching certainty that if I looked in those mirrors, I wouldn't see the empty seat behind me. I felt a heavy, oppressive presence pressing down on the back of the bike, weighing it down. It took me almost half an hour to drive a distance that usually took 5 minutes. The absolute worst part? The exact second I turned the corner onto my home street, away from the university, the weight instantly vanished. The bike shot forward, running perfectly normal. I had to slam on the brakes to avoid crashing into a wall. I locked myself in my house that day. I cried. I honestly just sat on my kitchen floor and cried because I felt so completely powerless. But the climax, the moment that truly broke me, happened a week later. I was determined not to let this unseen garbage bully me out of my job. I walked into the lecture hall, chest out, refusing to show fear. I greeted the security guard, chatted with a few students, my voice loud and crystal clear. I felt good. I stepped up onto the wooden podium. I opened my binder. The words were there. Perfect. I looked up at the class, took a deep breath, and opened my mouth to say good morning. The moment my lips parted, it felt like someone shoved a fistful of dry, jagged fiberglass down my windpipe. It wasn't a tickle. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a violent, suffocating blockage. My throat completely closed up. I gagged, my hands flying up to my neck. I tried to inhale, but all I could do was produce this pathetic, wheezing gasp. I started coughing so hard, my eyes watered. The students were staring at me in dead silence. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard my nails dug into the varnish. My vision was blurring. I was staring hyper-fixated at a tiny chipped piece of laminate on the corner of the desk, watching a tiny bead of my own sweat drop onto it, while my brain just screamed, "Fucking hell. I'm going to choke to death right here in front of 50 kids." I couldn't speak. Not a single syllable. Every time I tried to force air over my vocal cords, it felt like razor blades. I had to frantically write on the chalkboard, instructing them to do a silent reading exercise. For 45 agonizing minutes I stood there, silent, my chest heaving, tears of pain pricking my eyes. The second the bell rang, I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door. I took 3 steps into the outdoor hallway, and the blockage vanished. Just like that, my airway opened up. I took a massive, shuddering breath. My throat didn't even hurt anymore. I turned back to look into the empty classroom, and that familiar freezing draft washed over my face, as if something was standing right in the doorway, staring me down. They don't want me speaking. That was the chilling realization. Whatever was in that school didn't want me lecturing. I wasn't the only one suffering, either. My colleague, Hazel, the one who helped me at the buffet, confessed that she was being tormented too. She told me this deeply violating story about how she was lecturing in her traditional silk dress, the aodai, which is quite thin, so naturally she wore a white undergarment beneath it. She was standing at the podium facing her class when she suddenly heard a loud, sharp snap. Something had violently yanked her bra strap from behind, pulling it so hard that the metal clasp actually broke. She said it stung her skin like a whip. She was absolutely terrified, staring at her 50 students, but they were all just quietly taking notes, completely oblivious. There was literally no one behind her. She had to spend the rest of that 2-hour lecture awkwardly pinning her arm against her side, walking sideways like a crab, too scared to turn her back to the chalkboard, until the room was empty and she could run to the bathroom to safety pin her clothes back together. A few days later, I finally broke down and talked to an older colleague, a man named Silas. I didn't tell him everything, just hinted that the campus felt heavy. Silas looked around nervously and told me that the week prior, he was teaching a literature class. Out of nowhere, a remarkably quiet, shy student named Arthur stood up, slammed his fists on the desk, and started screaming absolutely vile, aggressive obscenities at Silas. It was the kind of guttural rage that didn't fit the kid at all. Silas told me that before he could even react, Arthur just collapsed back into his chair, hitting his head on the desk. When he woke up a few seconds later, the kid started sobbing uncontrollably, completely unaware of what he had just done. He was hijacked from the inside. And it didn't just end in the classroom. Silas told me the administration actually called Arthur down to the principal's office using the campus loudspeakers. When the kid got there, he was completely disoriented, his face pale and exhausted like he had just woken up from a coma. When they interrogated him about the insults, Arthur just broke down sobbing, swearing he didn't do it. They even brought in the other female students to testify, and every single one of them confirmed that Arthur was the sweetest, most bullied kid in the class, and that the aggressive, raspy voice coming out of him earlier didn't even sound human. The poor kid was so traumatized by the disciplinary mark on his record that he ended up transferring schools shortly after. Hearing all this made my stomach turn. I needed to know what the hell we were dealing with. So, over the next few weeks, I started hanging around the cheap sidewalk cafes and canteens just outside the campus gates, buying iced coffee for the older locals who had lived in Bintan their whole lives. And they confirmed the nightmare. They told me that before the university was built, long before the government cleared it, that massive plot of land was an illegal, unmanaged graveyard. Because Saigon was a hub for migrants, poor workers who died far from their home provinces were just buried there in unmarked dirt. Hundreds of forgotten people, abandoned, with no families to burn incense or pray for them. When the city expanded, they just bulldozed over it to build the foundations of our school. We were walking on top of a massive, restless tomb. I realized then how naive I had been. I went to my church. I didn't ask for an exorcism, but I brought a small wooden rosary. I started keeping it in my teaching binder. I hung a small cross on my heavy motorbike. But more importantly, I changed my approach. During my breaks, I would walk around the empty edges of the courtyard. Alone, I would speak softly, not to anyone visible, but to the air. I told them that I acknowledged they were there. I told them I was a Catholic, so I couldn't offer them food or incense, but I promised to say a prayer for their peace every single day. I respectfully asked them to let me do my job, because this was my livelihood. I set a boundary, and slowly, the cold drafts stopped. The mechanical failures stopped. I could eat my food. I could speak. I survived my tenure there. But the absolute horror of it is that there is no resolution for that campus. Even now, almost 20 years later, I still hear the stories. Every single year, a new batch of fresh, skeptical graduates gets hired to teach at that university. And every single year, without fail, some of them experience the dropping temperatures, the invisible hands swatting their belongings, the choking fits. It's an endless cycle of trauma, because the dirt they are standing on still belongs to the dead. When I get the chance, I quietly pull those young teachers aside and teach them how to walk the courtyard and set their boundaries. I tell them straight up, if you're Buddhist, you need to go to your temple and ask the monks for a protective blessing, and if you're Catholic like me, I personally drag them to my church to get some guidance. But what about the ones I don't catch in time? What happens if one day a teacher reacts the wrong way, and instead of just choking them, the entities decide to pull a full Arthur on them? It makes me sick to my stomach just thinking about the sheer vulnerability of being completely sane, yet entirely at the mercy of something that defies all logic. Have any of you, especially those of you who work in old public buildings or schools, ever felt that specific, targeted drop in temperature, that sudden oppressive silence where your body just inherently knows you've crossed into someone else's territory? If you have, please tell me I'm not the only one who had to negotiate my sanity with an empty room. I read the comments. I really need to know I'm not crazy for believing this. I genuinely appreciate you sticking around to listen to an old teacher vent. Please, if you ever feel that unnatural cold creeping up your neck, don't ignore it. Just acknowledge it, keep your head down, and stay safe. Hopefully my nightmare saves you from yours. I'm done for tonight.